end of July 1942, heat did not subside even at night near the Don River. An enormous starry sky and sizzling hot steppe heated during the day. Pickaxes and spades of Soviet soldiers dug into the petrous earth. Artillerists of the anti-tank battery prepared their operating sites and organized defense in the bend of the Don. Now there was a bluff shore behind their backs, but the soldiers knew that German tanks approaching from the west were striving further, to the Volga. Today, the artillerymen of the anti-tank and howitzer batteries, anti-aircrafters, were to play a key role in the battle for the city, which had recently been renamed Stalingrad instead of Tsaritsa. Petri McKinn, Georgy Bertansky, and others in Artillerymen of the Liberators series. The war had been going on for 2 years, having recovered from its defeat near Moscow and Rostov. On June 28, 1942, Wehrmacht struck a hard blow on the southern part of the Soviet-German front line. The aim of the German summer campaign was to gain access to the coast of the Caspian Sea. Paulus's 6th Army was assigned a very important task in this operation, to protect the flank of the penetrating force battling through to the oil. Paulus's troops were to go along the Don steppes, several hundred kilometers, and advance to Stalingrad. In early summer 1942, the German command did not consider this task challenging. The Soviet artillerymen took up the defensive disposition in the bend of the Don River, at the point where its stream approaches the Volga. The German tanks had to go just 60 kilometers to Stalingrad from there. The artillerymen of the anti-tank batteries were to stop or to hinder the advance of these tanks. The preparation of the firing positions, that is, of the area where the artillerymen were organizing defense, started at night. After many kilometers of marching, there was no time for sleep. The gun had to be emplaced. Recesses for projectiles and trenches for the soldiers had to be dug by morning. The soldiers dug a circle 3 meters in diameter and 50 centimeters deep. The gun was emplaced there. This allowed firing the gun in different directions. Small trenches were dug nearby for the commanding officer, the gun layer, and for the chargeman. The whole crew did not need to be at the gun during the battle. One person was quite enough. After the round, the gun layer could cover in a trench while the chargeman was driving another shell into the barrel. Even if the gun was hit directly, at least one of the crew had a chance to survive. By dawn, the position was ready. Guns were put into an emplacement, and freshly dug earth was camouflaged with withered grass. There were 2 steel cases with shells close to the gun. One of them contained high explosive shells which could be used to attack the firing points and the infantry of the enemy, and the second one contained anti-armor shells for destroying tanks. The ammo boxes were 15 meters away from the firing position. Well, now the sound of mortars is heard from the west. The soldiers take their positions. A German tank appears from behind a hill some 700 meters away from the crew. The gun commander calls, "At the tank. Anti-armor." The breech block is open. The chargeman drives a shell into the breech ring. The breech block closes automatically. Range, elevation 14. The gun layer sets sights at 14, and by manipulating vertical and horizontal mechanisms, swiftly brings the crosshairs of the sighting unit, called panoramic sight, onto the tank. But the tank is moving, so the gun has to be aimed continuously. The tank is approaching closer and closer. The gun layer pauses and finds a good moment for a round. It happens because the tank moves in a zigzag motion, changing its direction and speed of movement. The gun layer, having positioned the crosshairs a bit in front of the tank, is waiting for the tank to come into the crosshairs. Fire! Finally, a round is heard. The trace left by the shell in the air, makes it evident where the shell passed above the tank. Long hit, the gun layer calls. Shell! The chargeman drives it into the barrel, but the tank has already moved a bit forward and discovered the gun because of the dust cloud. A short stop, and the flame flickers from the tank gun. The hostile shell whistles by over the soldiers' heads. The commander makes the firing range 100 meters shorter. Range, elevation, less by 2. There is machine gun firing from the tank. 2 or 3 bullets strike the gun shield, but the Soviet gun fires again, and a black cloud of smoke surrounds the tank. In some 3 to 4 seconds, there is another round heard. And the tank, having turned sharply, stops and goes on fire. In less than a minute, a German shell whistles in the air and explodes not far behind the gun. Another one explodes in front of the gun. It is clear that the third shell will hit the position. Having brewed just one tank, a gun revealed itself and often fell prey to an accurate round of another tank. Then the tanks rushed into the position and crushed the soldiers and the gun with their caterpillar tread. So it is no coincidence that a Sorokopyatka gun was nicknamed Farewell Motherland. It was often said about anti-tank regiments: a long barrel, a short life, or double wages, triple life. Soldiers and officers of the Fighter Anti-Tank Regiments, FATR, were paid 1.5 allowances, and for a brewed-up tank, the gun layer and the commander were awarded with a premium of 500 rubles. Other members of the crew got each 200 rubles. And the hash mark of FATR fighters, a black diamond with crossed guns, was the symbol of courage and bravery. After having suffered a wound, most soldiers of the Great Patriotic War tried to come back from the hospital to their unit. But the combat conditions did not allow this all the time, and the command did not always favor these requests of soldiers. Only few arms of service were an exception, including the anti-tank artillery. According to the order dated July 1st, 1942, soldiers and officers of the anti-tank regiments were to return back to their units. That is how the command tried to preserve the substantial and indispensable experience of fighting tanks, which artillerymen could only gain in the battlefield. In 1941 and 1942, the main anti-tank gun of the Soviet Army was the 45mm gun model, 1937, which was called by the soldiers a Sorokopyatka, Russian for 45. This is exactly why batteries of Sorokopyatkas stood as the defensive screen blocking the Germans' ways to Stalingrad. A 45 gun was used to fight armored targets and infantry of the enemy during the entire war. It penetrated 43mm armor from 500 meters, which before 1943 was enough to fight the majority of hostile tanks and self-propelled guns. Artilleryman Mikhail Chernomordik recalls, 45mm guns, stumpy, lightweight, but they were extremely vulnerable. A low and narrow shield did not ensure protection from hostile fire. Until 1943, we could relatively successfully fire the tanks, but any mistake of the crew, as a rule, meant a death threat for the artillerymen. In 1943, heavy tanks Tiger and Panther and the modernized T-4s with 80mm front armor appeared on the battlefield. This armor was beyond the capacity of the Sorokopyatkas. To fight these tanks, Soviet artillerymen received a 57mm TIS-2 anti-tank gun.
Однако самым массовым...
However, the gun, which was used most commonly during the Great Patriotic War, was ZIS-3, a 76mm divisional gun model of 1942.
1942 года.
It was simple and enjoyed low production cost, but at the same time, it was at the time one of the best artillery guns. It could effectively attack infantry, artillery, and destroy firing slits of hostile firing points made of concrete. ZIS-3 was well suited for fighting tanks, and starting from 1944, it actually became the main anti-tank artillery gun of the Red Army. In just 2 months of combat action during March back from Kharkov to Stalingrad, anti-tank artillery blew up 400 German tanks. But as the battlefield was more often in the hands of the enemy, most of these tanks were restored. By the 20th day of August, German tank regiments broke through to Stalingrad. The artillery was to say a decisive word in the city defense. Before the war, a career artillery officer had 3 years training. He would learn the mechanism of all types of guns and had a significant firing practice. But during the war, when many artillery schools were evacuated to the far corners of the country, while the front line continuously required new commanders, the term of training was reduced to 4 to 6 months. The future commanders of platoons and batteries studied the tactical science, guns, communication, topography, engineering, and automotive science, and learned to fire at firing ranges. Military students were trained to deliver direct fire and fire from a defilade position when the target is located beyond the line of sight of the artilleryman. In the latter case, target accuracy depends to a large extent on the academic training of the commanders, skills with gauges, and the ability to make accurate calculations. At the firing range, the students were given tasks to perform a full and concise preparation of data for target shooting. For this end, the future artillerymen were given the position data of the hypothetical target and the weather data affecting shell deviation. The concise training was done faster. Afterwards, at the front line, young artillerymen found out that there would be no time for a complete training in combat conditions. Vladimir Bant recalls, "The commander of the artillery school battery told us, take it easy about academic science. Learn how to use foot wrap well, without wrinkles. As for fighting, you will be in divisional or anti-tank artillery, engaging in direct fire. And there, once you see it, you fire." Having made the required calculations, the students by no means at all classes could verify whether they were correct. In conditions when the shells were supplied first of all for the front line, academic instructors often told students that every round they fired was a pair of box cat boots. However, students necessarily had target practice. Here, future artillery aces were very soon discovered, those who possessed necessary skills and an inborn intuition. Artilleryman Mikhail Borisov, hero of the Soviet Union, recalls, "I remember the first firing practice with a 76mm regiment gun at a moving target. A wooden dummy tank was dragged after a truck with a long tow. I destroyed it with the first round. Captain Epifanov, battery commander, said, 'Impossible. Get the second dummy.' They dragged it. I destroyed this with the first round too. He swore, 'Don't give him any more ammo, or we'll run out of dummy tanks.'" During classes, crew members permanently changed roles so that every military student could try himself as a gun layer and a loader, a gun commander, and the commander of the firing platoon. Students also studied powerful artillery systems. Petri McKinn recalls, At practical classes, a gun crew of 8 people must, as a toy, tow, turn, and bring into firing position a large tonnage gun. A shell weighs 43 kilograms, and steel spades, which are inserted into the ends of the trails, are 100 kilograms each, and you must drive it into the earth with a vast hammer. After the training, young commanders were sent to reserve artillery regiments, where future crews and fighting units were mustered, and afterwards they got to the front line. On August 23, 1942, German tanks, having broken through the Soviet defense line around Stalingrad, reached the Volga River, coming closer to the workshops of the tractor plant. Simultaneously, Luftwaffe started mass bombing of the city. By August, there were 566 air defense guns and 470 anti-aircraft machine guns at the Stalingrad Corps Region Air Defense. Anti-tank aircraft city defense was divided into 7 sectors, and each of them was protected by 1 regiment. Gun crews of these artillery guns and machine guns were primarily staffed with girl volunteers. Army discipline, soldiers' uniforms several sizes too large, heavy physical effort. All this turned very hard work for the girls who got to the front line. Firing an 85mm anti-aircraft gun, this was very hard for a woman. Sergeant Valentina Chediva, commander of an anti-aircraft gun, recalls. At first, nose and ears were bleeding. The stomach was utterly upset. The throat was so dry one could vomit. It was not so hard at night, but during the day, it was very bad. It seems that an aircraft is flying right at you, exactly at your gun. It is not so often that anti-aircraft gunners succeed in shooting down an aircraft. But this is not the main thing. The main task of an anti-aircrafter is to stop aircraft from target bombing, force them to fly high, where the accuracy of bombing would be minimal. The shell bearer set the destruct distance. For example, the height where the shell would explode and scatter around in frags. Burst clouds made German aircraft maneuver, changed the speed and height of the flight, which hindered bombing. However, on August 23rd in Stalingrad, anti-aircraft gunners could not cope with more than 600 hostile aircraft, which performed 1,500 mission sorties. In just several hours, one of the most beautiful cities in the USSR was turned into ruins. By the evening of September 12th, when the just-appointed new commander of the 62nd Army, Vasily Choykov, arrived in Stalingrad, his troops had retreated into the city. Choykov's army was cut from the other Soviet forces and pressed to the Volga from the front line and flanked by a horseshoe of German divisions. Many did not believe they could still hold Stalingrad. In this critical situation, Choykov made the only possible decision, to station heavy artillery not in Stalingrad, but on the opposite bank of the Volga. In Stalingrad, there were no horses or tractors left, which could be used for towing heavy artillery guns. Besides, moving along the streets pitted with bomb and shell craters was impossible, and considering the total air domination by Germans, such targets were easily hit by hostile bombers. Nikolai Shishkin recalls, in April 1943, after obtaining lieutenancy, I was appointed commander of an Su-122 self-propelled gun. During that time, first Soviet self-propelled artillery weapons Su-122 and Su-152 were supplied to the troops. These were artillery guns mounted on the chassis of T-34 and KV-1 tanks. Instead of a rotating turret, the gun was mounted onto an armored coning tower. In the middle of the war, the Soviet industry created self-propelled guns designed for tank destruction, armed with 85 and 100mm guns. The shell of an Su-100 penetrated from armor of the Tiger from over 1,500 meters. Low-range guns, howitzers, differ from guns not only by a heavier charge. Guns are most effective when firing at the so-called low trajectory. Its target is most often within the line of sight range. These are tanks, firing points, and structures. The flight trajectory of a howitzer shell has a steeper curve. Howitzers can destroy targets located at the distance up to 30 miles, which are also hidden from artillerymen by the terrain or the buildings. However, as the target itself is not visible, the results of the battery fire are not to be seen. That is why, to ensure precise fire, adjusters should always be at the forefront of the battle, who would report to the battery on the results of firing and make corrections. Installation of heavy artillery in Stalingrad on the eastern bank of the Volga both increased the ability of the batteries to survive and increased the freedom of fire maneuvering and made ammunition delivery easier. However, Choykov had to expend great effort to convince the command in the feasibility of this step. At first, combat performers were depressed with this decision too. Ivan Shalayev, artilleryman, recalls, "When our troops saw that heavy artillery was crossing to the farther bank of the Volga, everyone perceived it as a sign that Stalingrad would soon be left." But the subsequent days of the battle proved the correctness of Choykov's decision, and the soldiers were again full of confidence. Artillerymen from the opposite bank invariably supported battalions fighting in Stalingrad with their fire. Only artillery scouts, adjusters, and communications men, who provided communication between the observation point and the firing position, were left in the city. Staying undercover, the fire adjuster observed the German positions and reported the coordinates for firing. At the forefront, not far from the observer, there was the battery commander, who made calculations for firing and gave commands to the executive at the battery. Artillery scout Georgy Patansky recalls, "My observation position was in a trench at the bank, and afterwards, when our troops captured the mill, I went there. I was observing from a window about the 4th floor high, and I did not use binoculars, but a periscope. There were a lot of snipers, and if I raised my head above the windowsill, a sniper would immediately kill me." In the evening, on September 27th, Sergeant Yakov Pavlov received an order to survey a house, which was located 100 meters in front of the mill. Having crossed the square covered with dead bodies, an infantry detachment got down to the basement through a window. The residents of the house warned them that they had heard German speech at the other part of the building. After showering Germans with grenades, the Red Army men captured the building. Soon after that, Lieutenant Afansiev's platoon, ensuring the defense, arrived at the house. Afterwards, communication men and artillery scouts came. It was difficult to find former streets and squares with familiar names among the ruins of Stalingrad. Not house addresses, but strong points, firing points, and other landmarks for artillery firing were plotted on maps. Any basement, plant workshop, bedroom in a flat, or the remnants of a pipe could obtain a proper name. Thus, the Pavlov's house designation appeared on Soviet artillery maps instead of Region Consumer Union. Artillery scout Georgy Patansky chose a place to observe between the floor structures at the top floor of Pavlov's house. A communication man with a telephone was close, on the landing between the floors. The German positions were not far from the house. At dawn, a field kitchen arrived. The German soldiers were approaching it with pots in hand. Putansky reported about what he had seen to the battery commander, who stayed at the mill basement, some 100 meters away from Pavlov's house. The commander immediately prepared the data for firing. A radio operator transmitted his message to the left bank of the Volga, where the batteries of Soviet howitzers were located. A communication man at the firing point repeated the command he had heard out loud to the senior at the battery. Usually, the senior at the battery executive officer, repeated all commands at the top of his voice. Gun commanders repeat the command to their crews, and all crew members of all 4 artillery pieces of the battery get down to work. Gun layers wind azimuth hand wheels. Breech block operators open gun breech blocks and wind elevation wheels. Caisson personnel snatch shells from boxes, wipe them with a cloth, and pass them on to the bearers. There are commands heard from the guns. First ready, second ready, third ready, fourth ready. The battery senior officer shouts, "Fire!" Gun commander, gun! This is his command to the gun layer for a round. The gun layer pulls the lanyard. There's a round, and the gun layer reports to the gun commander. Round. In 1 to 2 seconds, battery commander staying at the mill in Stalingrad hears the voice of the communication man. Round. Grigory Putansky recalls. The rounds of our guns are heard in several seconds. Shells are landing. The calculation was good. 2 shells got right into the field kitchen, and 2 others exploded nearby. Few stayed alive. In the moments of inactivity between battles, artillerymen were primarily busy cleaning and adjusting their guns. Nikolai Markov recalls. After firing, cleaning is a must. The gun layer was aligning the sight line to the reticle. In case of some faults at the battery, there were 2 gun busters who corrected these. But failures were rare, as the gun was very reliable. The everyday life of artillerymen was very similar to the life of the infantry. Soldiers, even when pressed to the Volga, tried to arrange their frontline life somehow. The soldiers knew in what dugout at the Volga a good watchmaker or a shoemaker were to be found, where one could put an edge on a knife, and where a gram was. The relations between artillerymen at the front line were brotherly. E.C. Krazik recalls. Subordination was relative, relations built upon mutual trust and respect, but there was discipline. All kinds of harsh manual tricks were perceived as something unacceptable at the front. Officers gave up their supplementary rations into the pool. Traditionally clever and trained people were enlisted into the artillery. At dawn, after a short night's sleep, new battles were awaiting artillerymen. Artilleryman Lazar Sens recalls. In the course of time, the fears got less acute. We stopped being surprised by anything or fearing death. Everything what the war was offering us, starting with hard frontline life in trenches and finishing with constant deaths around, we perceived as something self-evident. The remnants of Choikov's army, obtaining just scarce replenishments, hardly held the field at the Volga. But even then, fresh Soviet detachments and forces were concentrating to the north and south of Stalingrad. They were to strike a crashing blow at Paulus's army. Artillery was to become the main crushing power of the advancing fronts. The drone of engines was heard constantly. These were guns, tanks, and automobiles moving to the front line. Artillery intelligence uncovered important targets, enemies' centers of resistance, hostile observation points, and artillery batteries. On November 19, 1942, Soviet troops started a counter-offensive near Stalingrad, which began with a mighty artillery preparation. If during the counterstrike of the Red Army near Moscow, the density of the Soviet artillery rarely exceeded 30 to 40 guns per 1 kilometer of the front line, these figures were around 80 to 100 guns and mortars per 1 kilometer at the beginning of Operation Uranus, aimed to envelop Paulus's army. It means that guns stood on average every 10 meters of the front line. The famous Katyushas finished the artillery preparation. In response to their signal, the infantry started the attack. Multiple launch rocket systems, nicknamed Katyushas, represented a new secret weapon. The works on this weapon started as early as the 1930s. In summer 1939, aircraft projectiles, RS-82, mounted on I-16 and I-153 fighters, were first used at the Kulkin-Gul battles. And by 1941, designers also engineered a land-based launching platform, BM-13. It is remarkable that a decision about launching the mass production of Katyushas was taken just a day before the beginning of the war, on June 21st, 1941. These machines were first produced on mass scale at the Moscow compressor plant. Projectiles were manufactured both in Moscow and in other cities. In August 1941, a group of designers engineered a BM-8 rocket platform with 36 launchers based on CIS-6 chassis, and in September, a BM-8 with 24 launchers based at the T-40 light tank chassis. New models were immediately put into production. Later, 300mm projectiles appeared. In the Army, these were nicknamed Andreyushas, or tadpoles, because of their peculiar shape. In general, artillerymen liked giving nicknames to weapons. For instance, M30, the howitzer, was nicknamed Mommy, and ML-20 howitzer was called Yamelka. Even German jet-powered 6-barreled mortars were nicknamed donkeys, creaky, because of their specific sound, or Veniushas, as opposed to Katyushas. Even the Katyusha itself was called Raisa Sergeyevna, as a derivative from the abbreviations RS. RS for Reaktivny Snaryad, rocket-powered shell in Russian. However, there is no single version for the origin of the name Katyusha so far. The most widespread is still a presumption that the name was taken from a famous Blanter's song. But why was it a rocket-launching artillery system that got this name? There is a version that test engineers who worked at the testing ground among themselves called rocket projectiles CATs. CAT is an abbreviation from Kostikov, Automatic Thermal, named after the project manager, Andrei Kostikov. Thus, we have Katyusha. Another option is that the name comes from the letter K on the mortar body, as launchers were manufactured by the plant named after Kalinin. According to another source, it was the Comintern factory. The first battery of the field rocket-launching artillery was mustered on June 28, 1941. It was established within 4 days at the 1st Krasny Moscow Artillery School, decorated with the Red Banner. It was Captain Flyorov's battery that fired the first salvo at fascists at Orsha Station. Upon Stalin's initiative, all frontline Katyushas were brought into a new arm of service, GMR, which meant Guards Mortar Regiments. It was hard to get into these units. Only the best graduates of artillery schools and artillerymen with battlefield experience and irreproachable personal background were sent to serve there. As a rule, the newly qualified Guards Mortar gunners learned all the tricks of firing Katyusha at their regiments only. Furthermore, even commanders of Guards Mortar Regiments knew only the small part about the mechanism of the rocket launcher necessary to accomplish the mission. Besides, there was an order according to which every Katyusha commander had to blow it up in case of a threat of the enemy capturing the launcher. Every launcher was equipped with a box of TNT blocks for this purpose. The failure to carry out this order meant for the commander a threat of execution by firing squad according to a tribunal sentence.
Установки
The
были
launchers were classified top secret, and therefore at the beginning of war, such commands as give fire were prohibited. Instead, commands sing or play were used, which were possibly associated with the song Katyusha. In 1941, Katyusha rocket launcher was mounted on the chassis of the domestic ZIS-6 truck, light tanks, and even tractors. But as early as before the Battle of Stalingrad, Katyushas were beginning to be based on the chassis of the Lend-Lease Studebaker truck, which significantly increased their cross-country performance. Alexander Zuev, commander of a launching platoon, recalls, "This is, after all, a cross-country vehicle, this Studebaker. Both the front and the rear axle are driving, maneuverable, reliable. And as for ZIS, you start driving, it dies, all kinds of things happen. They were feverish." The BM-13 unit itself was a metal frame with a rack of 5-meter steel H-beams mounted on it. 16 to 24 rails were installed on one truck. The frame with the rack of rails was solidly mounted on the rotating frame. The launcher had both a rotating and an elevating gear, bracket for the sighting unit with regular artillery panorama, and an iron fuel tank fastened onto the cab. At the rear of the chassis, 2 swinged jacks were mounted. Cab windshields were covered with folded armored blast covers. Opposite the seat of the combat vehicle commander, a small rectangular box was fastened onto the front panel. It had a spinner looking like a phone dial disc and a handle. This device was called the Fire Control Console, the short form FCC. A cord assembly went from the console to the accumulator and each rail. When the FCC handle rotated, the electrical circuit was completed. An exploder in the front part of the rocket's chamber of the shell went off. The rocket charge ignited and there was a round. The rate of fire was determined by the rate of rotating the FCC handle. 16 rockets from a BM-13 unit could be launched in 8 to 10 seconds. When at the area of the future battle, the soldiers of the Guards mortar regiments dug companiers for Katyushas at the main firing position. First of all, in winter, when the earth was hard as granite, the trench was dug deep enough just to cover the most essential part, that is, the truck's engine. If the truck did not leave the position right after the salvo, in a minute, the battery would be hit with German shells. To prepare the salvo, ballistic artillery tables were used. Maximum firing range was 7 kilometers. That is why it was very hard to precisely estimate the assumed shell dispersion. Aiming was based on the rail's elevation. The commander of the launching platoon was in charge of the salvo, as both the battery commander and the operations platoon commander were right at the front line. Command was given. Deflection, angle so-and-so, aim at azimuth. Elevation, range so-and-so. Ready. Safety caps off. Ready. Cruise to shelter. And then, at the fascist swine. Battery, in salvo. During the salvo, the fire gun commander was in the launcher cab. If one of the rockets did not go off the rails, the command, launcher commanders switch off FCCs was given. Sometimes a salvo from the twin, 2 rows of rails with 8 rockets in each, was fired with a delay. This was called buying time. It means launch 1 rocket at a time, one after another, 16 rockets within 16 seconds. The results of Katyusha firing had a petrifying effect. During the salvo, all rockets were launched practically simultaneously, and in several seconds the territory around the target was literally plowed by shells. At the same time, the deafening howl of the rocket flying was literally driving one mad. The Germans even nicknamed Katyushas Stalin's organ. Those who did not die under the fire were often unable to furnish resistance, as they were contused, deafened, or psychologically suppressed. The entrapment of the German disposition near Stalingrad began on November 19, 1942, with the mass artillery fire. This date is still celebrated as the Artillery Day in memory of the first large-scale victory of the Red Army. As a result of the well-organized advance of the infantry in cooperation with the artillery, the tanks, and cavalry, a 300,000 alignment of German forces was encircled near Stalingrad on the 23rd of November. But when entrapped, the Germans continued to fight. Hitler threw the Don Army Group led by Manstein to break through the Stalingrad pocket in December. But the Soviet troops resisted and destroyed these divisions. On 10 January, the Red Army began the last decisive offensive near Stalingrad. It again was accomplished with a powerful artillery preparation. The sounds of firing and exploding artillery shells, mortar projectiles, and air bombs all merged into one single roar. During just several days of the battle, artillery fire brewed and burned 100 hostile tanks, crushed and destroyed 70 batteries, demolished around 1,000 wood and earth firing points and over 1,500 dugouts. On February 2nd, the German troops which stayed in the northern part of the city were encircled. Choikov arrived at the observation site at the ruins of the Krasny Oktyabr plant office to personally see the last salvos of the Battle of Stalingrad. Afterwards, Choikov recalled this day. The offensive started at 12 a.m. Artillery preparation was short. There was only direct laying and rounds at visual targets. We clearly saw the Germans rushing about the ruins. Right away, the offensive of our rifle units and tanks began. The Nazi who were still alive did not try to resist the last attack. They put their hands up. They had white cloths on their bayonets. Vitaly Ulanov recalls. After the rain, the regiment lined up at the hillside. The soldiers in heavy great coats soaked with water slip, puttees uncoiling. The regiment's commanding officer went up to the hill to present awards to the military personnel. And suddenly, they pushed me. Go, it's for you. What? And now I hear Junior Sergeant Ulanov. The Order of the Patriotic War, First Class. I walked in a wet great coat along the hillside. I approached, reported that I had arrived to get the award, but the regiment's commander held the order in his hand, turned it back and forth, scrutinizing it. What a nice order. I snatched it. I served the Soviet Union, turned around and walked back to the line. The guys patted me on the shoulder and asked to show them the order. Of course, it was very exciting. The Order of the Patriotic War was established in 1942. It was awarded to enlisted men and officers for exceptional bravery, endurance, and courage on a battlefield, and contribution to the success of warfare by their actions. This became the first order established during the Great Patriotic War. For the first time in the Soviet award system, the statute to the order contained the list of specific heroic deeds for which the distinguished person could be put forward to the decoration. Moreover, the Order of the Patriotic War is the first order with distinction into classes. During 35 years, the Order of the Patriotic War remained the only Soviet order, which was passed on to the family as a memory after the death of the person decorated. The other orders had to be returned to the state. Only in 1977, this rule started to pertain to other orders and medals. During the war, there were 324,000 awards with the First Class Order and 951,000 with the Second Class Order. Among themselves, commanders called the set of the orders of both classes the officer's kit, and it was a great honor to have this. In 1985, just before the celebration of the 40th anniversary of the victory, an edict was passed according to which all active participants of the war, including partisans and cryptos, were awarded the Order of the Patriotic War. In addition, All marshals, generals, admirals, holders of any orders and medals, such as for courage, Ushakov Medal, for combat merits, Nakimov Medal, Partisan of the Patriotic War awarded during the war, as well as Patriotic War veterans were awarded the first-class order. The frontline soldiers who did not pertain to any of these categories were awarded the second-class order. One of the greatest battles in the world history ended with the victory of the Soviet Army. It was here, near Stalingrad, that the Soviet artillerymen proved that their arm of service was deservedly called the God of War. The artillery was used increasingly on a larger scale all the way to Berlin. During the artillery preparation before the Berlin offensive, the density of the Soviet artillery was increased up to 200 to 300 guns per 1 kilometer of the front line. During the war, the Red Army used more heavy guns than any other army of the countries at war. The artillery continued leading the way for the troops and proved its status of the main strike force of the Red Army.